So I'm honored to be speaking to CNN senior national security correspondent Alexander Marquardt from O News. Alex and I actually first met when we were both reporting on the 2008 presidential campaign. I was at Fox. He was at CNN the first time. He has since gone on to a storied career as a foreign correspondent, award-winning foreign correspondent, I should add. He was with ABC News in Moscow, Jerusalem, Beirut, and London. And then he returned to CNN to cover Washington, and now is in Kyiv and has spent several weeks now in Ukraine. And Alex, I'd love to hear you. First of all, we should begin. I'd love for you to kind of set the stage of what you've been witnessing over the course of the past couple of weeks, where you're coming to us from now, and what you've been seeing from Kyiv.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm super proud of everything you built, and I follow along, and it's really impressive. I got here about 3.5 weeks ago, and we've been all over the country. And for the first few weeks, really until this invasion started on Thursday morning, it was entirely a game of will he, won't he. We had all these very bleak assessments coming from not just the US, but from the rest of NATO. You had this, you had the Ukrainians disagreeing with that, saying we don't believe there's going to be a war, trying to play it down in order to keep their population calm. And so there were a lot of daylight there between President Zelensky and President Biden. You had all these predictions about things that were going to happen. They didn't really come to pass. I got out of Kyiv pretty quickly after first getting here. Went down to the southeast to a place called Mariupol, which is really interesting because it's really right in the southeastern part of the country. So it was basically on two Russian flanks. It's in the Donbass, it's in the Donetsk province, which is one of the separatist areas, and it's on the southern coastline. So you've got the Russian Navy in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. So it was a really good location to be, and that's where I was when the invasion actually started. But it then became clear that Kyiv was going to be such a huge story, and still is a huge story. All these really dire predictions that it would fall within 24 to 48 hours. So we made our way up here, very long drive from the southeastern corner all the way up to Kyiv. And we've been here for the past few days, and it's just been fascinating to be here. We hear explosions around the city all the time. They haven't landed very close to us, it must be said. You can hear them very clearly. You can hear some gunfire. These really haunting air raid sirens go off all the time. A curfew just ended today after about 36 hours. So people went out and just swarmed grocery stores, getting supplies. Curfew went back into effect for the night. And we had these talks between the Russians and the Ukrainians today in Belarus, hoping that it means that tonight will be quiet. But you have to imagine the Russians still have their sights set on Kyiv. So we're kind of bracing for some tough hours and days ahead.
Yeah, you were talking about those initial expectations about Kyiv falling pretty quickly. I spoke to the former CIA director, Mike Morrell, last week, who had said prior to the invasion, the Russians can take Kyiv in 3 or 4 days. I saw one of your more recent reports where you're out in the streets and you say that there is some optimism about the fight that the Ukrainian military is putting up right now. What's the feeling in terms of how civilians are feeling right now about the state of play, and what are Ukrainian government officials saying to you about how long they feel they can withstand the Russian assault?
It was really, in terms of the civilians, it was really remarkable to see the change, because they almost to a man and woman insisted to me, this is not going to happen. We're not worried about this. There was zero panic that I saw on the surface level. You talk to people and they say, yeah, we're worried. Yeah, we're concerned. But there was also a very prominent attitude, especially in the East, of we have been living next to a front line for 8 years. We are used to Russian threats. We saw Russia invade our country and steal land in Crimea in 2014, and they didn't necessarily buy it. And they said, if it happens, we're going to fight. This is not the Ukraine of 2014. We are stronger. We're more patriotic. Our military is stronger. So then the invasion happens, and sure enough, you have all these people signing up to what are called the territorial defenses, which is basically just civilians who are given guns and allowed to go fight, sort of ragtag militia type things. And on top of that, now you've got President Zelensky saying anybody who from abroad who wants to come fight can come here and we'll arm them, which is really interesting. So you really have seen civilians taking to the front lines. At the same time, the country is barring men from 18 to 60 years old from leaving the country. So a big component of this is going to be, civilians fighting this Goliath of an army. Lots of people have talked about this, comparing this to David and Goliath, and it's perfectly apt. On the military side of things, it has surprised everybody. You talk to any military official, Ukrainian or foreign, and they will tell you they're very happy with how it's gone. A large part of that is because they have gotten a lot more organized in the past 8 years. A huge part of that is because they've got all this weaponry that has come in from the West, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of weapons from the Europeans and from the Americans. And frankly, the Russians have not played their cards right. We've been trying to figure out, why has Russia not done more? And a lot of it is they're overstretched. Their supply lines are too long. They're having a tough time refueling. A lot of their equipment is old and is breaking down. You have to imagine that there is a morale issue because not only are Russians attacking their brothers in Ukraine, but they've been sitting out in the cold for the past few months, wondering, just like us, will he or won't he? So, as the piece that you were referencing, I said that there is optimism, but it's too soon for confidence. Obviously, Ukrainians are very happy with the way it's going, but Russia has a lot more that they can throw at this. And while Ukraine is very happy with all the support they've gotten, they need a lot more. At the end of the day, they're getting all this aid, but they're the only ones fighting here on the ground. There are no foreign armies coming to their aid.
Right, and I wanted to know how people feel about that, because obviously, I'm sure they're hearing about or seeing the images of hundreds of thousands of people, having solidarity rallies in Berlin, in London, in Birmingham, Alabama, in Sydney, Australia, in Tokyo. The EU sending weapons, the US sending weapons, the various sanctions, but ultimately no other countries are putting troops on the ground to fight alongside the Ukrainians. Is that frustrating to them? Is that something they want?
Well, I think that at least at an official level, Ukraine's been really frustrated that that NATO obviously hasn't welcomed them with open arms. That in fact, NATO leaders have said this can be a very long time before they actually join. Today, you saw the EU say that they're ready to welcome Ukraine in. So that's obviously going to make a lot of people happy. You talk to Ukrainians, a lot of Ukrainians, and many will disagree, but a lot say, we feel much closer to the West. We feel much closer to the European Union than to Russia, and we should be part of the EU. And the EU today said, they're one of us. I'm sure that that the people here are really bolstered by, what they're seeing from abroad. That it's very encouraging. But yeah, also have to imagine that they're, very, very focused on the matter at hand. I mean, you've got families, trying to get out by the thousand. Those scenes from the borders, not just with Poland, but with Slovakia, with Hungary, with Moldova. I mean, people are just trying to get out in droves. And then oftentimes fathers are dropping their families at the border and turning right back around and fighting. So we've seen some really heartbreaking scenes at the border crossings. There's a lot of fear here, but it is remarkable to see the world turning against Putin to try to get him to pull out. And so I do think there's a sense, again, that they're happy and surprised to a large extent with the way things are going, but they know that, it's only been 5 days and Putin had massed, depending on who's saying it, anywhere from 175 to 200,000 troops on 3 sides of this country.
Yeah, I was curious, as you went out there in Kyiv, the people who've stayed behind, the people who are not evacuating to the West, why, obviously there's, males of a certain age need to stay behind, but in terms of other folks who might not be conscripted, why have they stayed behind?
I think what you'll see a lot of is, and I've seen this in other countries where there are wars, it's like, where am I going to go? What am I going to do? When I was out in the East, I asked someone if they were going to leave their village, and he said this to me. I was kind of inferring, are you going to go westwards within the country? Not, are you going to leave the country? I think a lot of people would like to see if they can weather it and would rather be in their home, in their city, and hope for the best than living in a refugee camp or living in a tent or spending hours on the road and in unfamiliar places. So I think that's probably pretty true across all conflicts. I don't think we necessarily have a good sense of the numbers in terms of who wants to stay, who wants to go. As I mentioned, here in Kyiv, until this morning, there was a 36-hour curfew, so people weren't really leaving. But at the same time, you've seen these masses at the Kyiv train station to board trains heading west. The Ukrainians have put on extra trains to get people out of here. And, people are really gonna have to make up their minds soon, because we could come to a situation very, very soon in the coming hours where the city is completely encircled and they can't get out. And so just, on a personal level, this is what we say to our Ukrainian staff. If you'd like to leave, and go be with your families or try to get out of the country, we completely understand it. If you're staying here, whether you're a journalist or Ukrainian, you have to assume that the city is going to get encircled at some point soon.
This is a question I got, and you kind of are taking us that direction, which is a lot of questions about these foreign correspondents. How do they ensure their own safety? Are you in touch with the Russian military, the Ukrainian officials, letting them know where you are, this feeling that, as a journalist, you're safe? But, where are you joining, or can you give me a sense of where are you joining me from? And how does CNN and how do you ensure you're safe? And when do you make the call that I can't be reporting from here anymore?
It's a really good question. So I'm in an international hotel in downtown Kyiv. See, it's pretty nice. I have no complaints about my lodgings whatsoever. I've covered a bunch of wars, as you know, Moshe, in Gaza, and a bunch. I've covered two in 2012 and 2014. And when I was staying there, what we would do is we would give the Israelis our coordinates. We'd let them know where we were. And the Israelis were very good at staying away from hitting the hotels. We don't have a line into the Russians like that, as far as I know. Maybe people above my pay grade have done that, but I don't know that. This hotel is chock full of Western journalists. I've met Germans. Sorry, not just Western. I met a Japanese team today as well. And it's everybody that I run into, all of our old colleagues at other networks. These are all very experienced conflict correspondents and cameramen and producers. We as an organization have told people, again, if you're feeling at all uncomfortable, if you are on the fence, you should probably get out, whether it means going to Lviv, which is in the western part of Ukraine, or just going somewhere else. We are operating under an understanding that, again, this city is going to get hit repeatedly by the Russians, but also get encircled, and there could be some dark days ahead. In terms of personal security, I mean, it is different from person to person, and it's different from day to day. I mean, frankly, my biggest concern right now, today, or tomorrow, even if I went out, is not running into Russians necessarily. It'd be running into some fairly jumpy Ukrainians at checkpoints. An 18-year-old kid who just got a gun for the first time and is signed up to these reservists or militias. I think that's a much bigger security risk right now. I don't believe that Russia wants to come in here and kill everybody. I was in Crimea when Russia invaded in 2014. They didn't fire a shot. I think they have designs on Kyiv. They want to control it. They want to topple the government. If I were a government minister right now, I'd be very worried, but I don't fear the Russians if I run into them. I do fear, however, that the longer Ukrainians push back, the longer this city holds out, the more brutal the Russian military could get, and that Putin may push them harder and harder. We've started to see some worrying signs where the Kremlin has accused the Ukrainians of hiding weapons like artillery and other heavy weaponry in civilian populations. There's no evidence of that, but you can just game that out and imagine that at some point they're going to say, "Oh, well, of course we had to hit that residential area because there was a weapon system there." So that's really unnerving right now.
I was going to say, I imagine you're seeing the reports and the images coming from Kharkiv of the civilian buildings being targeted there. I guess the question is, obviously that's a Putin strategy to try to inflict enough pain on the civilian population that they push Zelensky to surrender. What's the feeling you get from Ukrainians that especially as they look towards Europe and now feel more and more Western, that there will come a point when, civilians will say, we don't like it, but we don't want to see Kyiv destroyed by the Russians?
Yeah, I think we're pretty far from there. I also don't necessarily think that Putin wants to destroy Kyiv. I mean, this is a beautiful city, and I mean, who knows? I could be wrong. And you're right. Kharkiv, which for your viewers, it is the second biggest city in Ukraine. It is right up against the Russian border, about 20 miles from the border. There's actually been street fighting in the city over the weekend, which we haven't really seen here. And just today, a residential area was hit. Russia continues to deny that they're targeting residential areas. So I don't think we're there yet. The Ukrainians have a lot more fight before they consider surrendering. What we're trying to figure out right now is there were these talks today between the two sides, and we know that the Ukrainians went in saying, we want an immediate ceasefire, we want a withdrawal of Russian troops. We didn't hear a rejection necessarily from the Kremlin. Both sides decided or said they would be willing to talk in a few days, but we don't really know what items they listed as a pathway to more discussions. Diplomacy discussions are always good. It usually means that the guns aren't firing. So that's why I'm saying it'll be interesting to see tonight what happens. But while we're talking, I'm watching CNN in the background, and I can see that that the worst is still to come for Kyiv, according to the U.S. And I do believe that. But the Russian side this entire time has been completely unpredictable. So it's go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, if we probably had this conversation a couple of weeks ago, even the conversation a week ago, does Putin invade? Well, if he does, is it just in the eastern provinces versus taking over I think a lot of people, even longtime watchers of Putin and the region, and that's a question I had for you. So you were based in Moscow nearly a decade ago, if I'm
2009, 2010. Yeah.
You're now here, 12, 13 years later. Any remarkable changes, shifts? What have you observed, both in your experience in Moscow 12 years ago and in the region, and now that you return? What are your observations about what has shifted?
Well, what was interesting about the time that I was in Moscow was one of the few years that Putin was not actually president. He was prime minister at the time. Medvedev was the president. He was kind of in the shadows, and he actually did a pretty good job of keeping to himself. We didn't hear these sort of, designs to rebuild the Soviet Union. That really came up in 2014 when I had already moved to the Middle East, but I came back here to cover all that. And again, covering the invasion and annexation of Crimea was just remarkable. I mean, to watch, I got called by my boss, and he's like, "Hey, we're here. We heard about these forces. We're at the airport. Can you go check it out?" And that was the little green men that we've talked about, who were just walking all around the airport. And then they took over more and more territory in Crimea and took over all the military bases. And there was no response.
Explain who the little green men are.
Little green men were soldiers, fully kitted out, camouflage uniforms with their guns, but no patches. We couldn't tell where they were from. They wouldn't talk to us. They were just, there was nothing identifying about them. We suspected they were Russian, but we didn't really know it. So they got this moniker, the Little Green Men. And eventually, Russia, of course, admitted that they were their forces. And then after Crimea was stolen, they started backing these pro-Russian separatists in the eastern part of the country, which eventually became these weird little enclaves that were out of the control of Ukraine, but not formally under Russian control. The other day, President Putin officially recognized them as independent. So there's some speculation now that Putin is pressuring Zelensky through this invasion to basically give those areas their autonomy. There's a belief that Putin wants what we're calling a land bridge to connect Crimea with the rest of mainland Russia, so like a strip along the southern coast. There's speculation that he actually wants all of eastern Ukraine, all the way up the Dnieper River. The Dnieper River snakes down the country and really cuts it in half. Not many people think that he actually wants to take and hold Kyiv. Really just wants to come in here, decapitate the government, put in a puppet. I mean, I was here 8 years ago when that President Yanukovych got kicked out, and he was a pro-Russian guy. And for 8 years, President Putin has complained about that. So now he's back trying to put in his own puppet again. but there are all these different scenarios, Moshe, of
Yeah.
what could happen. Again, 100 and almost 200,000 forces on three sides of the border. The guy has a huge menu of options.
So you've covered, you mentioned a couple of the wars you covered in the Middle East, and now the war in Ukraine. What's your feeling? Any significant differences, similarities? Are you more fearful in some ways? Does this feel bigger in some ways? How do you kind of take your experience in the Middle East and apply it to what you're seeing in Ukraine right now?
I think there are obviously some basic components to all of these conflicts. When you cover a war, it really exposes a country and a people. It exposes the worst parts of people and the best parts of people. You see countries coming together, people rallying together, people helping each other, supporting their neighbors. It also reveals a really dark side sometimes when you see, neighbor turning against neighbor. Which is something that we've seen a lot of in the Middle East, and you could argue we're seeing now with Russia turning on Ukraine quite literally. These are very different, of course. You've got the way that President Zelensky likes to frame it is that this is not just a war about Ukraine. This is a war about Europe, and this is going to upset. If President Putin goes through with the worst case scenarios that we've laid out, this will upset the security order of the past 30 years in a very, very fundamental way. And, we're talking about countries with nuclear weapons. And so that's when it gets very, very dangerous. So I think the ripple effects from this are possibly larger than, say, a war in Syria or a war in Gaza, which to a lesser extent are a little bit more localized, to a bigger extent are more localized. But there are those similarities. And frankly, the reason I want to cover these conflicts is because it really does drill down to who people are, and to see people sort of, acting in some of the most extreme situations. And it really reveals what a country is made of. It's always very sad. It's sometimes you always have to step back. When you're working so hard, you're like, I got to do this story, I got to do that story, especially in TV, you got to I got to get that element, I got to get that element, and put together my package. And then you got to step back and be like, this is a country that's falling apart. These are people that are terrified. They're people are getting killed. It's all very, very distressing. And what I think the only encouraging thing out of all this is the world's paying attention. Everybody's paying attention. And as you noted, you got these protests and demonstrations and all kinds of support for Ukraine right now. And I think that's something that Putin really underestimated.
Yeah, I know you only get a couple hours of sleep because they put you to work. So I want to let you go, but I had a couple final questions for you. And one, you noted earlier, you have CNN on behind your camera right now. And talk to me about kind of the irony of that you're on the front lines, you're in Kyiv, being encircled by the Russians, witnessing what's going on. And to what extent do you feel plugged into what's going on? And to what extent do you feel completely out of touch with how the story is evolving around Ukraine?
Air raid siren going off. I don't know if you can hear that, but I feel. So, for example, that we just had this curfew for the last 36 hours. And so I didn't get out of the hotel that much. So, it's hard to talk to people unless you've got their phone number and you can text them. Even yesterday, journalists were exempt from the curfew. So I actually managed to escape for about an hour. Even that was so nice to be able to just get out into the street and really just get a sense of the total stillness and the total quiet. So this is why, and you've worked in cable news, you know how this works. A day like today, I was on live all day long, the entire day, and I didn't leave the hotel. Tomorrow, I'm going to get out of the hotel, go talk to people, try to get a sense of how they're feeling. That's really what I enjoy the most, is that reporting. It's getting on the ground. It's talking to those people, listening to their stories, and then trying to interpret their stories and for our viewers back home and make it understandable and make them care. Because I think right now there is not an apathy, but a lot of there is a question of, why should Americans care, for example, because it's so far away. And so I think it's part of my job to try to help that, and to help people who are far from here understand that this is about humanity. These are people who are being attacked, who are suffering, who are scared. And so I want to get out as much as possible. At the same time, it is dangerous. We are quite restricted. And so you're always trying to work that balance.
What is the thing that you think Americans most need to know to understand the region? You grew up in Europe, you spent a lot of time abroad. For the average American who's tuning into this potentially for the first time, this conflict, this region, especially as you talk to friends and family, maybe in the States, what do Americans need to know that would help them understand what's going on?
Well, okay. Well, first of all, on a very immediate level, understand geography. Like every time I do a live shot, I feel like I'm a geography teacher. And this is why on CNN, you're seeing maps all the time, because it's really, really important to understand, first of all, the size of Ukraine, which is the size of Texas. It's the second biggest country in Europe after Russia. You need to see that Russia's on the eastern border. You need to see that Belarus is right above Kyiv, and you need to understand, where the Sea of Azov and Black Sea are. So that's just an immediate term. And then the Ministry of Defense here the other day put out instructions or requests for citizens to put together Molotov cocktails to throw at approaching Russian troops. And it just made me think, can you imagine if the US was being attacked and the Pentagon was saying, hey guys, can you assemble Molotov cocktails? That's the level of desperation. That is the level of fear that this country has because of the huge force that Russia is coming at them with. So all I would say is, imagine if you're an American that, the country below or above you, both huge countries, are assembling their forces for an attack, and how you would feel. And how would you feel if the country next to you is being attacked? And can't you understand how terrifying that would be in terms of possibly you wanting to bring people into your home or into your country? I think all of this is really quite relatable. You just need to have a bit of imagination and put yourself in someone else's shoes, because this is it's very, very hard to believe that in these times that a country can just up and decide to invade another country for absolutely no reason. So in that way, it's very difficult. But at the same time, just try to imagine a huge neighbor coming at you, what you would do, and what you would do to help people who are being attacked.
And final question here, as far as Ukrainian feelings for Russia, Putin says, well, it's actually one country, Ukraine doesn't exist. Obviously the history of Ukraine and Russia go back, a millennia. What was, if to the extent that before the war, the feeling, the split in Ukraine about affinity for the West versus Russia, and what has this war meant for that going forward?
I think you kind of have a gradient where if you go from east to west, it's most Russian to least Russian. What is clear is there is a very strong sense of patriotism, and a lot of that comes from 2014 when Russia invaded the first time, or at least the first time in this century. And so in that sense, Putin kind of shot himself in the foot, because he's trying to bring Ukraine closer to him, but he's actually driving them away. So you've got, especially among younger people, people who are arguing that they feel more European. There's been a spike in pride of the national language. Ukrainians all speak Ukrainian and Russian, and where before they might have just defaulted to Russian in a conversation, now they take pride and pleasure in speaking their own national language. I speak very little Russian from my time living there, and so I was able to get around the East with a bit of ease, where they might start conversations in Russian. And I definitely believe that there are a lot of people, particularly in Eastern Ukraine, who say, I'm an ethnic Russian, I feel Russian, I should be part of Russia, especially in Crimea. But at the same time, when you hear Putin, giving a long, crazy speech about how Ukraine's not a country, and talking about their leaders as drug dealers and Nazis, drug addicts rather. Ukrainians are just like, we don't want to be part of that, and they look at Russia as the past. I mean, it's a country that has a faltering economy. There's nothing to get excited about in terms of belonging to Russia, and that's why I think you're seeing so many Ukrainians saying, "Hey, we're part of Europe. We want to look to the West."
Alex, thanks for chatting. Good luck with your coverage. Good luck getting out there today, and we'll be watching you. And most importantly, please stay safe. Thank you very much for having me. I can't believe we're saying goodbye as the air raid sirens are still sounding, but that says it all. I mean, these are tense times, and so it'll be very interesting to see what happens. And thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it. All right, thanks.